speaker this evening is a woman I call friend, although I've known her for only a short time. Carolyn Raffensperger, founder of the Women's Congress for Future Generations and the executive director of the Science and Environmental Health Network. An environmental lawyer, the country's leading expert on the guardianship of future generations, and one of the world's most respected voices on protecting the planet. We welcome you, Carolyn.
It's not often that I give talks in front of my boss, but Tom Goldtooth, who is the other speaker tonight, is actually on the board of directors of the Science and Environmental Health Network. And so he is one of the people who can tell me what to do. And early on in the relationship that I have with Tom, which has been a partnership around environmental issues, Tom said that an idea that I was working on called the precautionary principle was an idea that was very attuned to indigenous ways, which was the 7th generation rule. But the way that Tom would tell it to me is that Tom would stand next to me, and Tom is taller than I am, and he would lean his head in, and I would stand side by side, not looking at each other, and he'd say, "You know, Carolyn, the precautionary principle is a 7th generation rule." Now, I'm a Midwesterner, and I'm not given to hippie ways, and I'm not given to appropriating other people's culture, and I didn't know what to do with that. So I would nod and smile happily. And one day, a colleague of Tom's, who is then working for the Indigenous Environmental Network, Bob Shimmick, called me up and said, "How do we put together the precautionary principle with the 7th generation rule?" And he had put me on the spot. And in the minute, I knew what the answer was. The answer was that we could create new legal institutions. We could create a guardian for future generations. Now, where could we try that out? Places like the Pebble Mine up in Alaska, where they want to mine gold and they want 17 square miles of arsenic-laden water. How could we actually employ this idea of the guardian? We could have a guardian at the table that was the voice of future generations of all species. Imagine what that would be like. And out of that conversation with Tom and with Bob and with others, we began this project on the law and the rights of future generations. And some of you have heard me speak a great deal about that. And many of you know that I am a lawyer, and that the people that I desire to represent are future generations. And by the way, the names of God, in some traditions, one of the names of God is counselor, and that is the name of the lawyer, of the advocate, the one who speaks for justice. And I am here to be the voice of the future generations of all beings. Now, I had a dream some years ago, and many of you have heard this if you attended the Women's Congress for Future Generations, and that is that I had a dream about pioneers and the founders of pioneers getting married. They already are married. And that I went to the wedding, and they were going to do a name tag with our professions on it. And I wanted them to draw something about being a lawyer. And she had already started. I didn't even tell her. And what she drew on my name tag was the tree of life, holding the scale of justice. Imagine that it is not a blind woman, blinded by what? The market, capitalism? But the tree of life, holding the scales of justice. And that it is our responsibility to pass on a whole tree of life, that anything that jeopardizes the tree of life actually tips the scales of justice. Tips the scales of justice. I had a second dream where I was standing before a young tree of life, and one branch was already dead. And I was standing there charged with keeping the tree of life alive for future generations. And I was waiting for the others to come who also shared that charge. Is this the group? Are you the ones that have come to help tend the tree of life with me? Yes. Yes. Yes, the tree of life for all generations. So some of you know that the seventh generation, when Tom kept talking about it, seemed like a long time, so I try and calculate out what was that all about. And I was actually asked some years ago to go to a First Nations tribe up in the Northwest Territories to do the principles of perpetual care. And the principles of perpetual care were designed to take care of an abandoned gold mine. You know, notice mining just keeps on coming up in my story. You know, other people get to deal with endangered species or with, you know, cleaning up rivers. I keep dealing with abandoned mines and radioactive waste and what have you. I keep wondering what I did in a previous journey to keep on dealing with this. But I was asked to go and do the principles of perpetual care for a place that is toxic, and the assumption is that it will be toxic forever. So how do we as a people think about an abandoned gold mine that has covered thousands of square acres with arsenic trioxide, and what are the principles by which we think about that? And what I realized in looking at other places that will be toxic for thousands and thousands of years, the WIPP site, which is the Waste Isolation Pilot Project in New Mexico, which will store radioactive waste, get this, for 250,000 years. Now wait a minute, the precautionary principle and the indigenous idea of the seventh generation is the seventh generation. What's 250,000 years? Well, let's say 25 years per generation. We're at 10,000 generations. So we are outside of the kind of knowledge and the kind of law and the ways of thinking that would allow us to even protect the seventh generation. We are doing this with climate change. We are doing this with our mining. We are doing this with mountaintop removal. We are doing this with what we are, the atrocity of the tar sands. We are doing this with the atrocity of the Bakken pipeline. These are no longer simple things that we're just leaving to a couple generations that more technology can clean up. More technology cannot clean this up. When we are taking water from the water cycle and injecting it into the deep earth and killing the communities of microbial life way a mile below the surface so that we can extract the oil of the ancestors out of the body of the earth and ship it through these pipelines, the Bakken oil, through states like South Dakota and Iowa into Illinois, or the tar sands coming from Alberta down through North Dakota and South Dakota and Nebraska, and the contamination of our waterways. We are far beyond the seventh generation. And so I want to tell you a story about being a lawyer under those conditions. When you were starting to take things like the water out of the water cycle, which has never been done in all of history, in all of time, we've never done that. So, you know, I told you I was a lawyer, and there's some requirements for being a lawyer. One is I have to keep on going to school to keep up my law license. And I happen to be licensed in Illinois. And I went to continuing legal education credit, get a school, and I went back to my old law school in downtown Chicago. I dressed up so I wouldn't embarrass the world. You know, I looked like a lawyer. And I was the only lawyer in the environmental section that was defending the earth. Every other lawyer in the room either worked for government or worked for a corporation, defending corporations and their right to pollute our air, our water, and that air and water of your great-great-grandchildren. Now, the funny thing was, the government agencies there were telling an interesting story. At that point, we had this thing called the sequester, which cut all of the budgets of the federal agencies kind of, you know, all of the same percentage. Guess who really took a hit? The environmental agencies. Well, guess how states actually protect their water and their air and all those other things? They get pass-through money from the federal government. And states like Illinois are practically bankrupt. And so the entire conversation was how delayed permits were, how delayed enforcement was, and how corporations could get around those delays. They were not telling us how to use those delays to protect the earth. That in the absence of money, how would we do it? And at the same time, they began this really interesting conversation in Illinois. They had had a big group meeting, and everybody, Republicans and Democrats and some environmentalists, had agreed that they should come up with a law and they should regulate fracking. Now, if any of you know the debate, in New York, they just banned it, or they've come very close to banning it. The ban has not been issued permanently, but there's no fracking in New York. In Illinois, yay, go New York, go Sandra Steingraber, go our allies. So I joined with Sandra because I'd been president of the Illinois Environmental Council, I had run the Chicago office of the Sierra Club, and so I joined with Sandra and testified before the Illinois legislature trying to get a moratorium like New York so that we could leverage it. And it passed. And what I knew is that Illinois was going to pass a law saying it's the best law around, but they had no money to regulate it. They had no money to enforce it. They had no money to test the waters after they had fracked it. They had nothing. And so they were going to let it go ahead. And I went home and I sent in my law license. I said, this is no longer justice. When we are this far apart, between law and justice are so far apart that we cannot actually have justice under law, then something has to change. Something has to change. And so what I stand here is a lawyer on behalf of justice. And it's the law of the earth. It is the law of the tree of life, holding the scales of justice by which I choose to live. Some of you heard me say earlier that a tribe west of here, in the back in the oil fields, actually consider that the law is song. It is song. And I said, well, why is the law sung? And my indigenous friend said, because song can't lie. It must tell the truth. It must tell the truth. And when we have corporations that are considered people, when future generations do not have rights, when indigenous communities do not have the sacred guarantees of the ability to protect their land and their treaty rights, then we have a lie. That corporations can be considered people is a lie. And so we have a law that is based on lies. How do we get back to justice and line up justice with the law? Well, that's some of the work that I've been doing as an outgrowth of this incredible conversation with Tom Goldtooth and with other fabulous friends who are in the indigenous communities. And so we began working on the rights of future generations. Now, why rights? Now, there's a corresponding idea, which is responsibilities, and we don't talk about responsibilities very often. We don't have a constitutional provision that says human responsibilities or neighbors' responsibilities or states' responsibilities. We talk about rights. But future generations don't have rights. Mother Nature, the earth, does not have the same kinds of rights that a corporation has. And so we began this project to frame the rights of future generations and to create new institutions so that we could begin essentially an emerging law that would respect that tree of life. So, you know what's so interesting to me is when I tell people I'm a lawyer, they want me to read their wills, their contracts, all that stuff, because we have taken the law out of everybody else's hands, right? So the lawyer is the upwardly mobile one because they've got all the control over what the law says, what it means, how we interpret it. You don't know how to go to court on your own behalf. What if we had a do-it-yourself governance project where we began to think about what the law ought to be? Now, what's interesting to me is that the simplest definition of what the law is that the law is the set of rules a community agrees to be bound by. Do you agree to having corporations be people? No. No! We withdraw our consent. Do you agree that we should buy and sell the rights to pollute? No. We do not believe that the market should determine environmental law. And what is the case now is that free market, private property law is environmental law. You do not have a right to a clean and healthy environment unless you live in 5 states. And that's not been adjudicated very well. But imagine that we said you had a right to a clean and healthy environment that was as big as your right to own a gun. What would that feel like? Why is it that your grandson, your 4-year-old grandson, has a right to own a gun, but he does not have a right to be born without being polluted? We withdraw our consent to a world that says it's okay that a child can be born pre-polluted. We withdraw our consent from a world that says we will freely pollute the Mississippi River, or frack and take water out of the water cycle, or leave a tragedy and an atrocity to the 10,000th generation. We withdraw our consent. We can take back the law and line it up with justice. You know where we have injustice in this world. You know that the social injustices of treating black men or men of color differently than we treat white men is not just. And we know that the same law that allows people to pollute the earth differently in poor communities than in rich communities is not just. We can take back the law, and we can line it up with justice. This is do-it-yourself governance. We can create new institutions like the legal guardian for future generations. So, one of the things that we're doing is we created a set of legal principles that we're inviting you to adopt and begin conversations around these principles for use in your organizing, around confined animal feeding operations, around the Enbridge pipeline here going through Minnesota. All of these things, you can begin to use these legal principles. What is that all about? So, what the law ought to be. How many of you have worked on legislative campaigns? Well, and any number of them, switching the kinds of ideas around around marriage equality or women's reproductive rights, and there are any number of issues that people have worked on. Environmental issues are one of the big ones. How different it is when we join together and say, this is not just. So let me tell you some of the legal principles. And why does the law matter? My work on the precautionary principle is really simple. It says in the face of scientific uncertainty and the likelihood of harm, you take precautionary action. That says, look, we're looking at harm that may happen to future generations of all species or whatever it is, maybe a river or maybe it's the white pelicans in North Dakota. And so you take action to prevent harm to that. It's a future-oriented rule. And what happens is we know the facts. We have incontrovertible facts. We know that pipelines leak. We know that the runoff from our corn and soybean fields in Iowa are causing devastation to the Mississippi River. We know these things. We know that spraying pesticides willy-nilly on our fields cause birth defects. We have incontrovertible facts. Now, what happens when you go before your PUC, your Public Utility Commission? What happens when you go before an agency that the pollution control agencies and the environmental agencies is you give them the facts. But you know what they're required to do? Balance competing interests. They are expected to weigh the costs and benefits of regulating something, and it's measured in dollars. And so the economy always wins. And if you are going to say, so that 3 children are going to have autism, and 20 children are going to have asthma, and we're going to have an increase in breast cancer. Breast cancer rate now is 1 woman in 7 or 8, and when my mother got married, it was 1 woman in 3. And so we have the facts, but they are interpreted with the benefit of the doubt going to the economy. And that is why we have to change the legal framework. So we brought copies of the legal principles, and I want to tell you what they are. And then I'm going to turn it over pretty quickly to Tom, who can talk about some other things. The first is, what is the basis of the economy? Is it capital? No, it's the commons. It is the things that we share. The basis of our life together, the basis of the economy is the air, it is the water, it is the public roads, it is the public schools, it is wildlife. That is the basis of the economy. And it is a legal principle. Why do you get a hunting and fishing license? We need to assert this before commissions like the PUC when we're considering things like pipelines. Well, then what's the responsibility of government? You will hear pretty frequently that the role of government is to benefit the economy. It's to grow the economy. It's jobs. Didn't you know that? I live in Iowa. That's all I hear with presidential candidates, right? What if the role of government is to protect the common wealth and common health for present and future generations? It is not to grow the economy, unless you're talking about the commons. You are to increase the common wealth of the Mississippi River, the commonwealth of Lake Harriet, the commonwealth of the health of the deer and the other species that we share it with. That's the responsibility of government. Imagine that we begin to change the conversation so that they know that and hear it and feel it in their bones. And then how do they make decisions about the commons? Well, that wonderful idea of the precautionary principle, right? You take into consideration the 7th generation and future generations, and you take action to prevent harm to them. The 4th is no eminent domain for private gain. So we're going to give eminent domain to Enbridge to run this pipeline through. So if the function of government is to protect the commonwealth and health for present and future generations, then eminent domain is the unique power of government to move private property into the commons. It is not to privilege another private property owner. No eminent domain for private gain. 5th, citizens have a right and a duty to withdraw consent from government actions that threaten the commonwealth, communities, or future generations. And what's so interesting to me about this is another lesson that I've learned from Tom. And that is the idea that free, prior, and informed consent, which is your individual right not to have an experiment done on you without your free, prior, and informed consent. University of Minnesota cannot test a breast cancer drug on you without your free, prior, and informed consent. And this has now been extended into a community right. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has established that Indigenous peoples have a right to give their free, prior, and informed consent before a project can go through. You know, what's really interesting is that the Royal Bank of Canada has said they will not put through a project, they will not fund a project unless they have the free, prior, and informed consent of First Nations in Canada. But imagine that this individual right that we have coming out of Nuremberg, the Nazis experimented on people without their consent. What we are doing with Enbridge, what we are doing with the Bakken pipeline is we are experimenting on communities without their consent. We are experimenting on the future generations of all species without their consent. We cannot do that. And so free, prior, and informed consent. You are the voice of the river. You are the voice of future generations. You have an obligation to withdraw your consent and to give your consent to that which you know will hold up and nourish the tree of life. The sixth one, and I'm nearly done, is that polluter must pay. Why is it that the public must pay for the messes? Why is it that you must pay if you have been given breast cancer or your child has asthma from a corporation's pollution? Why is it that we should pay? The polluter must pay. The public cannot be stuck with paying the bills for spills or other damage. The seventh is that tribal nations have sovereignty to protect their land and water. And 8, corporations are not people and have no inherent rights. They operate solely at the will of the people. We withdraw our consent from a polluting corporation that cannot die, that has a right to take your land and put it into Enbridge's private pocket. We say no. We withdraw our consent. We can take back the notion of justice, and it is our obligation. We can do this. We can invent new institutions. And who better than women? Who better than women? Now, why women? Why women? First of all, as Gudgy Cook, a fabulous Mohawk midwife, says, we're the first environment. We have to nurture and take care of that. But you are part of the tree of life yourself. You have come from the earth, and you will return to the earth. And so you have a right at the table to speak on behalf of those who have no voice. And those of you who are elders, we do not respect elders nearly enough. You are in the position to become our beloved ancestors, to become the ones who say we withdraw our consent from those things that will damage future generations, not just the 7th generation, but the 10,000th generation. We withdraw our consent. And what I give my consent to and what I honor is making common cause with you on behalf of the Tree of Life.